Have you ever watched someone dig their own financial and social grave with a smug smirk plastered across their face? Richard Sterling certainly did. He sat in a polished mahogany chair in family court, audibly laughing as his lawyer finalized the divorce terms that would supposedly leave his wife, Alice, entirely penniless. He thought he had completely outsmarted the quiet, unassuming woman he'd been married to for 7 years. He thought his ironclad prenuptial agreement was his golden ticket to a new life. But Richard was about to learn a brutal, life-shattering lesson. Stick around, because by the time the judge reads Alice's actual financial disclosures, Richard's arrogant laughter will turn into a waking nightmare. The beginning of the end started on an unremarkable Tuesday evening in their meticulously decorated, heavily mortgaged 4-bedroom home in Newton, Massachusetts. Richard Sterling, a senior portfolio manager at the boutique wealth management firm Harrison & Cross, walked through the front door smelling of expensive scotch and cheap perfume. At 34, Richard was a man who believed the world owed him its undivided attention. He wore tailored Italian suits, drove a leased Porsche Macan, and spent hours curating his LinkedIn profile to project the image of a Wall Street titan. To Richard, perception was reality. If you looked wealthy, you were wealthy. If you looked powerful, you were untouchable. And then there was Alice. Alice was 32, a woman whose beauty was subtle and whose demeanor was endlessly patient. When Richard had met her 8 years prior at a mutual friend's subdued dinner party, she had introduced herself simply as a freelance historical consultant. She spent her days in cozy, oversized sweaters, drinking loose-leaf tea, and poring over digitized property records and old architectural blueprints on her laptop. She didn't care for designer handbags, rarely wore makeup, and drove a 5-year-old Volvo sedan. Richard had always viewed Alice as a safe, manageable accessory. She was presentable enough for company dinners, quiet enough not to challenge his ego, and financially independent enough, making what he assumed was a modest $40,000 a year, that she wasn't a burden. Before they married, Richard, ever the calculating opportunist, insisted on an airtight prenuptial agreement. "It's just standard procedure, Alice," he had told her 7 years ago, sliding the thick stack of legal documents across the kitchen island. "My career trajectory is steep. My family expects me to protect my future assets. What's mine is mine. What's yours is yours. We waive all rights to alimony. It's cleaner this way." Alice had read the document thoroughly, her hazel eyes scanning the legalese without a hint of distress. "If this is what you need to feel secure, Richard, I'll sign it," she had said, signing her maiden name, Alice Hayes, on the dotted line. For 7 years, Richard patted himself on the back for that move. He watched his income grow from $90,000 to a healthy $250,000 a year, supplemented by aggressive annual bonuses. He expanded his lifestyle to match, racking up credit card debt and taking out loans to maintain the facade of a millionaire. He never once looked closely at Alice's bank statements. They kept separate accounts, splitting the household bills 50-50. Whenever a large expense came up, like a new roof or an emergency plumbing issue, Alice would quietly write a check, which Richard assumed drained her meager savings. But on this particular Tuesday, Richard had decided he had finally outgrown his wife. He found Alice in the sunroom, curled up in a wingback chair, reviewing a dense PDF document on her iPad. "We need to talk," Richard said, not bothering to take off his coat. He stood over her, casting a long shadow. Alice looked up, calmly bookmarking her page. "You smell like Chanel No. 5 and vermouth, Richard. What is it?" Richard bristled, hating her unflappable calm. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope, tossing it onto the small table beside her. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "I'm filing for divorce," he stated, crossing his arms. He waited for the tears, the shock, the desperate pleas. He waited for the drama that would validate his importance. Alice simply stared at the envelope. "I see. Don't act so surprised," Richard scoffed, pacing the room. "We've been growing apart for years. I'm moving in a different circle now, The partners at the firm expect a certain dynamic, a certain presence. You're perfectly happy hiding in this house reading old books, but I need a partner who matches my ambition. He didn't mention Chloe Vanderwall. Chloe was the 26-year-old daughter of one of Harrison and Cross's biggest clients. She was loud, wore entirely too much jewelry, and looked at Richard like he was the Wolf of Wall Street. Marrying Chloe wasn't just an affair. It was a career move. "The papers are standard," Richard continued, his chest puffing out slightly. "Because of the prenup, this will be quick and painless. You keep your Volvo and whatever is in your checking account. I keep the Porsche, my investment portfolios, and the equity in the house, since I'm the one who paid the down payment." Alice finally stood up. She was several inches shorter than him, but at that moment, her presence filled the room. "You put down the down payment, Richard, but I have paid exactly half the mortgage and property taxes for 7 years. Are you intending to buy me out of my half of the equity?" Richard laughed. It was a sharp, patronizing sound. "Alice, please." The market dipped. "There's barely any equity left after the second mortgage I took out last year to float our lifestyle. The house is underwater. I'm actually doing you a favor by taking the debt off your hands. You should be thanking me." Alice's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. "You took out a second mortgage? Without my signature?" "I forged it." "Don't look at me like that. It was a formality." He waved his hand dismissively. "I needed liquidity for a hedge fund buy-in. It doesn't matter. The point is you walk away clean. You don't owe my creditors, and I don't owe you a dime of my income. We follow the prenup to the letter." "To the letter," Alice repeated softly. A strange, almost pitying smile ghosted across her lips. "Are you absolutely sure this is how you want to play this, Richard?" "It's not a game, Alice. It's business," Richard sneered. "Have your little strip mall lawyer look it over. But don't drag this out. You can't afford a protracted legal battle, and I have zero patience for one. I want you packed and out by the end of the month." Without another word, Alice picked up the envelope, tucked her iPad under her arm, and walked past him. "I'll have my attorney review it in the morning," she said, disappearing up the stairs. Richard poured himself a double scotch, grinning into the empty room. He had won. It was almost too easy. 7 months later, the crisp autumn air of Boston gave way to the stale, overly conditioned atmosphere of the Suffolk County Family Court. The divorce proceedings had taken slightly longer than Richard anticipated, entirely because of his own financial entanglements. His hedge fund buy-in had tanked spectacularly, leaving him scrambling to cover margin calls. To keep up appearances with Chloe, he had maxed out 3 separate credit cards on weekend trips to Aspen and St. Bart's. Richard was bleeding money, but he remained utterly unconcerned about the divorce. He had the prenup. Alice couldn't touch his base salary or his future earnings. Richard sat at the petitioner's table, drumming his fingers lightly on the polished mahogany. Beside him sat David Kensington, a high-powered, aggressive divorce attorney who billed at $800 an hour. Kensington was a shark in a tailored suit, known for leaving ex-spouses in financial ruin. Richard had taken out yet another personal loan just to afford him, believing that intimidating Alice into a swift settlement would be worth the cost. "Relax, Richard," Kensington murmured, adjusting his gold cufflinks. "I've reviewed the prenup a dozen times. It's bulletproof. She waived alimony, and she waived claims to any assets not held jointly. You're walking out of here clean. We'll get the house transferred solely to your name, absorb the debt, and cut her loose." "I am relaxed," Richard said, leaning back and crossing his legs. He smirked. "I just want to see the look on her face when the judge makes it official. She really thought she could squeeze me for home equity." At 9:55 a.m., the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Alice walked down the center aisle. She was dressed simply but elegantly in a tailored navy blazer and dark trousers. Her posture was impeccable. She didn't look like a woman who was about to be left destitute. She looked like a CEO walking into a board meeting. Beside her was her attorney, a man Richard had never seen before. Instead of the cheap strip mall lawyer Richard had anticipated, Alice was accompanied by an older gentleman with silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a deeply worn leather briefcase. He moved with a quiet, terrifying confidence. Kensington leaned over to Richard, his brow furrowed. "That's Arthur Pendleton." "Who?" Richard whispered back. "Pendleton. He's a senior partner at Vanguard, Hayes and Sterling, one of the oldest corporate and estate law firms in New England. He doesn't do family law. He does billion-dollar mergers and offshore asset protection." Kensington swallowed hard. "How the hell is your wife affording him?" Before Richard could answer, the bailiff announced the arrival of the Honorable Judge Thomas P. Gable. Everyone rose. Judge Gable was a no-nonsense man in his late 60s, known for his sharp intellect and zero tolerance for courtroom games. He took his seat, adjusted his reading glasses, and looked down at the massive stack of files before him. "Be seated," Judge Gable barked. "We are here for the dissolution of marriage between Richard Sterling and Alice Sterling, née Hayes. Let's cut to the chase. I have a prenuptial agreement here, signed 7 years ago. Mr. Kensington, does your client affirm this document?" "We do, Your Honor." Kensington stood, recovering his aggressive swagger. "The agreement is straightforward. Complete separation of premarital and individually acquired assets during the marriage. Mutual waiver of spousal support. My client simply wishes to enforce the contract as written. Mr. Pendleton?" Judge Gable looked over the rim of his glasses at Alice's side. Arthur Pendleton stood slowly. "Your Honor, my client also fully affirms the prenuptial agreement. She has no desire to contest it. In fact, we are here to ensure it is enforced exactly to the letter." Richard let out an audible, scoffing laugh. It echoed slightly in the high-ceilinged room. He turned to look at Alice, shaking his head. "She's giving up," he thought. "She realized she can't fight me." Judge Gable banged his gavel lightly, glaring at Richard. "Mr. Sterling, if you find these proceedings amusing, I can assure you the financial penalties for contempt of court will quickly sober you up." "Apologies, Your Honor," Richard said, wiping the smirk off his face, though his eyes still danced with triumph. "I'm just relieved we're all on the same page." "Right," Judge Gable muttered, opening a secondary folder. "Let's move to the mandatory financial disclosures. To execute the separation of assets as dictated by the prenup, both parties must provide a full, sworn accounting of all individual assets, debts, and income." "Your Honor," Kensington spoke up, "we have submitted Mr. Sterling's disclosures. As you can see, despite a robust income, my client carries significant debt attached to the marital home and personal investments. We are willing to take on 100% of the joint marital debt in exchange for a clean break, waiving any claim against Mrs. Sterling's modest personal savings." It was a strategic move by Kensington. Make Richard look like the martyr taking on the debt, making the judge more likely to finalize things quickly without digging too deep into Richard's shady second mortgage. "I see Mr. Sterling's disclosures," Judge Gable said, flipping through the pages. He then picked up a much thicker, heavier document bound in a blue legal cover. "And I have just received the financial affidavit from Mrs. Sterling. Mr. Pendleton, is this accurate?" The judge's voice had lost its authoritative bark. It was suddenly quiet, lined with genuine disbelief. Judge Gable took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and put them back on to look at the document again. "It is fully audited and accurate, Your Honor," Pendleton said calmly, "including all domestic real estate holdings, offshore trusts, corporate equity, and liquid assets." Richard frowned. Corporate equity? Offshore trusts? He looked at Kensington, who was suddenly looking very pale. "Your Honor, if I may," Kensington said, trying to sound confident. "We haven't had a chance to review opposing counsel's financial disclosure. Given my client's understanding of his wife's freelance income." Judge Gable looked up, locking eyes directly with Richard. The annoyance in the judge's eyes had vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated pity. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Gable said slowly, his voice echoing in the dead-silent courtroom, "did you ever actually ask your wife what her maiden name, Hayes, stood for, or what her consulting business entailed?" She looks at old house blueprints," Richard stammered, his heart suddenly beginning to hammer against his ribs. Alice sat perfectly still, not looking at Richard. She simply stared straight ahead at the judge. "Mr. Sterling," the judge continued, lifting the heavy blue document, "your wife is not a freelance archivist. Alice Hayes is the sole heir and primary shareholder of the Hayes-Bancroft Real Estate Trust, which currently owns roughly 40% of the commercial property in downtown Boston. Her consulting is managing a multi-generational empire." The silence that followed was suffocating. According to this sworn disclosure, Judge Gable read aloud, "Mrs. Sterling's individual net worth, heavily protected by the very prenuptial agreement you drafted and insisted upon, is estimated at just over $680 million. Richard's breath left his lungs in a sharp gasp. The room spun. Judge Gable leaned forward, holding Richard's gaze. "And per the contract you demanded, Mr. Sterling, you are entitled to absolutely none of it." The silence in the courtroom was not just quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating, physical presence. It pressed down on Richard's chest, making it impossible to draw a full breath. He stared at the blue legal cover of Alice's financial disclosure, his mind frantically trying to reject the words Judge Gable had just spoken. $680 million. Richard turned slowly to look at his wife. Alice hadn't moved. She was not gloating. She did not wear the smug smirk he had worn just 20 minutes prior. Her expression was one of mild clinical observation, as if she were inspecting a damaged architectural blueprint rather than the crumbling ruins of her husband's ego. "Your Honor, there must be a mistake," David Kensington finally stammered, his usual shark-like composure evaporating. The $800 an hour attorney scrambled to his feet, his hands visibly shaking as he adjusted his notes. "That figure, it's simply impossible. My client has been married to this woman for 7 years. They split household expenses. She drives a 2018 Volvo. She buys her clothes off the rack." Arthur Pendleton, Alice's silver-haired attorney, didn't even bother to stand. He simply leaned forward to his microphone. "Wealth whispers, Mr. Kensington. It does not feel the need to shout through leased sports cars and maxed-out credit cards." Judge Gable suppressed a harsh cough, masking a momentary flicker of amusement before his face hardened into judicial stone again. "Mr. Kensington, the audited financials are certified by Deloitte. The Hayes-Bancroft Trust is a matter of public record, albeit a discreet one. Your client's ignorance of his wife's actual status does not invalidate the sworn disclosures." Richard grabbed Kensington's sleeve, pulling him down aggressively. "Fix this, David," he hissed, his voice a desperate, wet rasp. "If she's worth that much, the prenup is unconscionable. We challenge it. We throw it out. I'm entitled to half, even 10%. 10% is $68 million. Kensington looked at Richard, his eyes wide with a mixture of pity and intense professional dread. "Richard," he whispered back, his voice strained, "you drafted the prenup. You used your own attorney to write it 7 years ago. You explicitly demanded a complete separation of assets, including future inheritances and trust distributions. You put a severability clause in it, ensuring that even if one part was challenged, the core financial separation remained intact. You locked her out of your $250,000 salary to protect yourself. In doing so, you built an impenetrable fortress around her empire." Richard felt the blood drain from his face, leaving his skin cold and clammy. His perfectly curated life was flashing before his eyes. "Let us review the exact terms of this ironclad agreement Mr. Sterling so graciously provided," Judge Gable announced, flipping to the 3rd page of the prenup. "Clause 4, Section B, Both parties expressly waive any and all rights to spousal support, maintenance, or alimony, regardless of any disparity in income or net worth at the time of dissolution. A very thorough clause, Mr. Sterling. You really wanted to make sure she didn't get a dime of your Wall Street bonuses, didn't you? Your Honor, circumstances have changed. Kensington tried to interject, though he sounded defeated. The only thing that has changed is your client's understanding of who he was trying to fleece, Judge Gable snapped, banging his gavel once to cut off the attorney. The agreement stands. Now let us address the marital assets and liabilities. Judge Gable picked up Richard's financial filing, the thin packet looking utterly pathetic next to Alice's massive binder. Mr. Sterling, the judge continued, his tone dropping to a dangerous icy level. You stated earlier that you wish to assume the entirety of the debt on the primary residence, keeping the property in your name alone, in exchange for Mrs. Sterling walking away without a claim to the home. Yes, Richard managed to croak, suddenly terrified of where this was going. He had thought the house was his only remaining asset, even if it was heavily leveraged. Are you aware, Mr. Sterling, that because of the second mortgage you took out 6 months ago, a mortgage currently carrying a 9% interest rate and a balloon payment due in 18 months, the property is underwater by approximately $140,000? I can manage it, Richard lied, his voice trembling. He had planned to use his year-end bonus to keep the wolves at bay, hoping his new relationship with Chloe Vanderwall would eventually lead to a bailout from her wealthy father. Alice finally spoke. Her voice was soft, melodic, and cut through the courtroom like a scalpel. He cannot manage it, Your Honor. Richard snapped his head toward her. Shut up, Alice. Mr. Sterling, one more outburst and you will spend the weekend in a holding cell, Judge Gable roared. Mrs. Sterling, you have the floor. Alice stood up gracefully. Thank you, Your Honor. 7 years ago, when Richard insisted I sign that prenuptial agreement, I realized something fundamental about his character. He valued financial dominance over partnership. I chose to stay in the marriage because, frankly, I preferred a quiet life, and he largely left me to my work. I paid exactly half of all living expenses out of my modest allowance from the trust, allowing him to feel he was the provider. She paused, looking directly at Richard. For the first time, he saw the chilling, calculating intelligence in her hazel eyes, the intelligence of a woman who managed billion-dollar acquisitions before breakfast. However, Alice continued, turning back to the judge, 6 months ago, Mr. Sterling required capital for a high-risk hedge fund investment. He took out a second mortgage on our jointly owned home for $350,000. He did this without my knowledge. Kensington jumped up. Objection. This is a standard divorce proceeding, not a financial audit of past marital decisions. Overruled, Judge Gable said sharply. Continue, Mrs. Sterling. Because my name is on the original deed, the bank required my signature for the second lien, Alice stated calmly. She gestured to Arthur Pendleton, who unclasped his leather briefcase and withdrew a single, clear plastic sleeve containing a document. He handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Your Honor, Pendleton said, his voice a low, ominous rumble. That is the signature page of the second mortgage. Beside it is a report from a certified forensic handwriting analyst. My client did not sign that document. Mr. Sterling forged her signature to secure a $350,000 loan, which he subsequently lost in a volatile market position. Richard's stomach plummeted into an abyss. He couldn't breathe. The room began to spin. Forgery, wire fraud, bank fraud. Mr. Kensington, Judge Gable said, his voice deadly quiet as he looked at the handwriting report. Is your client aware that forging a spouse's signature on a federally backed mortgage document is a Class B felony in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts? Kensington physically backed away from Richard. Your Honor, I had no knowledge of this document's origin. My firm was not involved in the execution of that loan. The lawyer was instantly entering self-preservation mode, throwing Richard directly under the bus. "I am officially referring this specific matter to the District Attorney's Office for Criminal Investigation," Judge Gable announced, making a sharp note on his pad. "Furthermore, regarding the divorce settlement, as dictated by the prenuptial agreement, assets and debts are to remain separate. The first mortgage will be split evenly. However, the $350,000 second mortgage, having been obtained fraudulently by Mr. Sterling alone, will be assigned 100% to him." Judge Gable looked down at Richard, the pity now entirely replaced by disgust. "You leave this marriage with a depreciating car, zero claim to your wife's $680 million estate, and over $500,000 in personal and fraudulent debt. The prenuptial agreement is enforced. Court is adjourned." The bang of the gavel sounded like a gunshot. Richard stumbled out of the Suffolk County Family Court an hour later, the autumn air hitting him like a physical blow. The world felt distinctly unreal. He was a senior portfolio manager. He wore a $3,000 suit. He was supposed to be the winner. Instead, he was a man walking on the edge of total annihilation. His hands shook so violently he could barely unlock his phone. He needed a lifeline. He needed Chloe. Chloe Vanderwall's family was worth millions. If he could just explain the situation, frame it as Alice being a vindictive, manipulative liar who hid her wealth to ruin him, Chloe would understand. Her father, a titan in logistics, could lend him the money to clear the fraudulent mortgage before the district attorney pressed charges. He dialed Chloe's number. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. He dialed again and again. On the 4th try, she picked up. "Chloe, thank God," Richard breathed, pacing frantically near the courthouse steps. "Listen to me. Something insane just happened. My ex-wife, she pulled the craziest stunt in court today. I need to see you." "Richard?" Chloe's voice wasn't its usual bubbly, adoring self. It was flat, cold. "My father just called me." Richard froze. "Your father? Why?" "Do you know who Arthur Pendleton is, Richard?" she asked, her tone dripping with sudden disdain. He's Alice's lawyer." "He's the senior partner at Vanguard, Hayes and Sterling," Chloe snapped. "He's also the primary legal counsel for my father's logistics company. He has been for 20 years. Arthur called my dad an hour ago. He told him exactly what happened in court today. He told him about the forged mortgage, Richard. Chloe, baby, listen. It's a misunderstanding. Don't call me that." She cut him off sharply. "My father explicitly forbade me from ever speaking to you again. You aren't a hotshot portfolio manager, Richard. You're a broke, fraudulent liability who's about to be indicted. Lose my number." The line went dead. Richard stared at his phone, his thumb hovering over the red screen. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He leaned against a stone pillar, gasping for air. His chest tightened with a searing pain. He had played a high-stakes game of chess, entirely unaware that Alice owned the board, the pieces, and the table they were playing on. He needed to get to the office. Harrison and Cross. He still had his job. He was still a top earner. If he could just secure his year-end bonus early, he could hire a criminal defense attorney to fight the forgery charge. He could liquidate his remaining minor portfolios. He could survive this. He rushed to the parking garage, paid the $40 fee with a credit card he prayed wouldn't decline, and drove his leased Porsche aggressively through the downtown Boston traffic. He pulled into the underground parking garage of the towering, glass-fronted skyscraper that housed Harrison and Cross on the 42nd floor. He took the private elevator up, trying to smooth his tie and practice his most confident, untroubled expression. "Perception is reality," he repeated to himself like a mantra. "Never let them see you bleed." When the elevator doors parted, however, the reception area was unnervingly quiet. The receptionist, usually quick to offer a bright smile, looked away nervously as he walked past. "Morning, Brenda," Richard said, forcing a cheerful tone. She didn't answer. Before Richard could reach the glass doors of his corner office, a figure stepped out into the hallway, blocking his path. It was William Harrison, the founding partner of the firm. William was a stern, uncompromising man in his late 50s, a man who survived 3 market crashes through sheer paranoia and strict adherence to the rules. Standing behind William were 2 large, uniformed building security guards. "William," Richard said, his forced smile faltering. "What's going on?" "We need to talk, Richard." "Conference room A." "Now," William ordered, his voice echoing in the silent hallway. Richard followed him into the glass-walled room, his legs feeling like lead. As he sat down, he noticed a cardboard banker's box sitting on the polished table. Inside were his framed degrees, his Mont Blanc pens, and the crystal bull statue he kept on his desk. "What is this?" Richard asked, pointing at the box, though he already knew the answer. The panic was rising in his throat, choking him. William remained standing, looking down at Richard with an expression of profound disappointment mixed with anger. 45 minutes ago, the compliance department received an urgent certified courier package from the law firm of Vanguard, Hayes and Sterling. Richard closed his eyes. Alice. The package contained a certified transcript of this morning's family court proceedings, William continued, his voice tight. Specifically, the portion where a judge formally referred you to the district attorney's office for forging a signature on a federally backed financial document. William, it's a personal matter. A messy divorce. My ex-wife is trying to ruin me. It has nothing to do with my work here. I swear to you, Richard pleaded, leaning forward, desperation bleeding into his voice. Nothing to do with your work here? William scoffed, slamming his hand on the table. You are a fiduciary, Richard. You manage millions of dollars of our clients' money. You hold Series 7 and Series 66 licenses. The absolute baseline requirement for your job is that you are not committing felony bank fraud. William took a deep breath, adjusting his suit jacket. Furthermore, the ethical violation clause in your employment contract is clear. The moment a formal criminal investigation is opened regarding financial misconduct, you are terminated for cause. You are officially stripped of your licenses, pending a FINRA review. You can't do this, William. I brought in $4 million in revenue last year. You need me, Richard shouted, standing up. I don't need a liability, William said coldly. He leaned in closer to Richard. And here is the part that truly seals your fate, Richard. Did you ever bother to look up the corporate ownership structure of this building? Richard blinked, entirely thrown by the question. What? The building? Beacon Tower Partners owns this building. And do you know who owns the controlling interest in Beacon Tower Partners? William asked, a grim, humorless smile touching his lips. A horrific, sinking realization settled in the pit of Richard's stomach. He remembered the name Judge Gable had read from the blue folder. The Hayes Bancroft Real Estate Trust, William answered for him. Your wife's trust is our landlord, Richard. And an hour ago, their legal representatives informed us that if a known fraudster remained employed on these premises, our lease, which is up for renewal next month, would be immediately terminated. William gestured to the 2 security guards waiting outside the glass door. You didn't just burn a bridge, Richard. You set fire to the entire island. Take your box and get out of my firm. While Richard Sterling was being unceremoniously escorted out of the building by 2 armed security guards, clutching a cardboard box of his useless accolades, Alice Sterling was sitting 3 miles away in the penthouse suite of the Bancroft building. This was her actual office. It did not have the sterile glass and steel coldness of Richard's Wall Street playground. It was a sprawling, elegantly appointed room lined with dark mahogany bookshelves, antique maps of Boston, and a massive hand-carved oak desk that had belonged to her grandfather, the founder of the Hayes Bancroft Trust. Alice stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, sipping a cup of Earl Grey tea, looking out over the city skyline. A significant portion of the buildings in her line of sight belonged to her family's portfolio. The heavy oak door opened behind her, and Arthur Pendleton walked in, his ever-present leather briefcase in hand. He took a seat in one of the leather wing-back chairs opposite her desk, a rare, genuine smile softening his usually stern features. William Harrison just called me personally, Arthur said, opening his briefcase to file away the court documents. Mr. Sterling has been terminated for cause. The firm's compliance department has already notified the SEC and FINRA regarding the fraud referral from Judge Gable. His licenses will be suspended by the end of the week. Alice turned around, her expression serene but meticulously calculated. And the district attorney's office? I spoke with ADA Sarah Jenkins an hour ago, Arthur replied, pulling out a legal pad. Given the paper trail we provided, the forensic handwriting analysis, the IP address logs showing the digital application for the second mortgage originated from Richard's private office, and the direct transfer of funds to his personal hedge fund account, she considers it an open and shut case of felony wire and bank fraud. They are drafting the arrest warrant as we speak. Alice walked over to her desk and sat down, resting her hands on the polished wood. For 7 years, she had played the role of the quiet, unassuming wife. She had never lied to Richard about who she was. She simply allowed him to believe his own assumptions. He had assumed freelance historical consultant meant she was a hobbyist making pennies. In reality, her consulting involved navigating complex historical zoning laws to facilitate multi-million-dollar commercial developments for the trust. It didn't have to be this way, Arthur, Alice said softly, though there was no regret in her voice. If he had simply asked for a divorce respectfully, I would have let him walk away with his car, his savings, and his inflated ego. I might have even paid off the primary mortgage as a parting gift, Arthur scoffed lightly. Men like Richard Sterling do not understand grace, Alice. They only understand leverage. When my monitoring team flagged the credit inquiry on your Social Security number 6 months ago, I told you to confront him. And if I had, he would have manufactured an excuse, gaslit me into believing it was a clerical error, and found another way to siphon money, Alice countered, her hazel eyes hardening. When I saw the forged signature on that second mortgage, I realized he didn't just view me as a prop. He viewed me as a mark. He thought he was untouchable because of the prenuptial agreement he forced upon me. She had spent the last 6 months meticulously building a cage around her husband, and Richard had happily handed her the locks and keys. She had hired the forensic analysts quietly. She had let him pour the $350,000 into a volatile hedge fund she knew was statistically doomed to fail, a tip she had subtly passed to him through a mutual acquaintance at a dinner party. She had orchestrated the timing of the divorce proceedings to align perfectly with the collapse of his investments and the renewal of his firm's lease with her trust. Every move Richard thought he was making autonomously was actually a predetermined step in Alice's grand design. Suddenly, the intercom on Alice's desk buzzed. It was Margaret, her executive assistant of 10 years. Miss Hayes. Margaret's professional voice crackled through the speaker, pointedly using Alice's maiden name. There is a man in the lobby demanding to see you, a Mr. Richard Sterling. Security stopped him at the elevators, but he is causing quite a scene. He says it's a matter of life and death. Arthur raised an eyebrow. Persistent, isn't he? Shall I have building security hand him over to the police for trespassing? Alice considered this for a moment. A small, cold smile touched her lips. No, send him up, Margaret. Let him see it. 5 minutes later, the double doors of the penthouse office swung open. Richard burst in, his $3,000 Italian suit wrinkled, his tie loosened, and his hair disheveled. He looked wild, cornered, and entirely broken. He stopped dead in his tracks the moment he crossed the threshold. His eyes darted around the cavernous, opulent office. He took in the original oil paintings, the panoramic view of the financial district, the discreet security personnel standing by the door, and finally, Alice, sitting behind a desk that commanded more authority than his former boss's entire firm. The reality of his profound miscalculation hit him with the force of a freight train. "Alice!" Richard breathed, his voice cracking. The arrogance that had defined him for 7 years was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow, trembling desperation. "It's Miss Hayes in this building, Richard," Alice corrected him, her voice echoing in the large room. To what do I owe the intrusion? We concluded our business in family court 3 hours ago." Richard took a step forward, but Arthur Pendleton subtly shifted his chair, a silent warning. Richard stopped. "You got me fired," Richard choked out, tears of panic welling in his eyes. "William threw me out. They're reporting me to FINRA. My career is over, Alice. I'm blacklisted from every major firm on the East Coast." "I did not forge a signature on a federal bank document, Richard. You did," Alice stated, her tone entirely devoid of empathy. "I simply ensured that the consequences of your criminal actions were delivered to the appropriate authorities. Accountability is a bitter pill when you're used to privilege." Richard fell to his knees. The sound of his expensive trousers hitting the hardwood floor was pathetically loud. "Please," he begged, clasping his hands together. "Please, Alice. I know I was cruel. I know I was arrogant. But you have hundreds of millions of dollars. You own this building. You could make this go away with a single phone call. Pay off the $350,000. Tell the DA it was a misunderstanding. If I get charged with a felony, I go to prison. I have nothing." Alice stood up slowly. She walked around the massive oak desk and looked down at the man who had laughed at her just hours before. "You drafted the prenuptial agreement, Richard," Alice said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet whisper. "You explicitly demanded that I never have access to your finances and you to mine. You wanted to protect your future. I am simply honoring your wishes. Your debts are your own. Your crimes are your own." She turned her back on him and walked towards the window. "Margaret," Alice called out clearly. The assistant stepped into the room immediately. "Yes, Miss Hayes?" "Mr. Sterling was just leaving. Please have security escort him out. If he returns to this property, have him arrested for criminal trespass." Richard sobbed, a pathetic, gut-wrenching sound, as 2 large security guards hoisted him to his feet and dragged him out of the penthouse. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing his fate. 3 weeks later, the crisp autumn weather had turned into a bitter, freezing New England winter. Richard Sterling sat on a stained, sunken mattress in a $1.60 a night motel off Interstate 95, staring blankly at the peeling yellow wallpaper. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and despair. He was wearing a grey college sweatshirt and sweatpants. His tailored Italian suits were currently sitting in a storage unit he could barely afford. The collapse of his life had been astonishingly rapid, a violent freefall with no parachute. The day after the courtroom disaster, his bank accounts were frozen by federal investigators. Because the $350,000 second mortgage was deemed fraudulent, the bank instantly called in the loan, demanding payment in full. When Richard couldn't produce the capital, they initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings on the Newton house. He had been given exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises. He had tried to call his parents in Ohio, begging for a loan, but his father, a proud, retired high school principal, had already seen the Boston Globe article detailing the high-profile fraud referral of a local wealth manager. The shame was too much for his family. His father had quietly told him to take responsibility for his actions, and hung up. Then came the loss of his prized possession. A week into his stay at the motel, Richard had walked out to the parking lot to find a tow truck hitching up his leased Porsche Macan. He had run outside, screaming at the driver, only to be handed a repossession notice. Without his exorbitant salary to cover the massive monthly lease payments, the dealership had wasted no time tracking the vehicle's GPS. He had watched his status symbol get dragged away down the highway, leaving him stranded in a town he used to mock. Now, Richard sat shivering in the motel room, waiting for a phone call that would determine his immediate freedom. His cell phone buzzed on the cheap laminate nightstand. He snatched it up. "Hello?" "Mr. Sterling, it's Greg from the Public Defender's office," the voice on the other end said, sounding exhausted and overworked. Because his assets were frozen and his income annihilated, Richard had been forced to rely on court-appointed counsel. "Greg, Please tell me you have good news. Did you speak to the DA? Will they drop it to a misdemeanor? I'll do probation, community service, anything, Richard pleaded, his fingernails biting into his palms. Richard, I need you to listen to me very carefully, Greg said, his tone devoid of any of the shark-like confidence David Kensington used to possess. ADA Jenkins is not playing ball. The evidence they have against you is insurmountable. They have the IP logs, the forged signature, and the financial trail of you losing the money in a high-risk fund. It is textbook felony wire fraud. So what are you saying? Richard's breath hitched. I'm saying she formally filed the indictment this morning. A grand jury indicted you on 2 counts of bank fraud and 1 count of identity theft. The arrest warrant has been signed by a judge. The walls of the tiny motel room seemed to violently contract, crushing Richard's ribs. An arrest warrant? They're coming for me. I negotiated a surrender, Greg interrupted quickly. I told them you aren't a flight risk. You need to be at the Suffolk County 1st Precinct tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp to turn yourself in for booking and processing. We will try to argue for bail at the arraignment, but given the financial nature of the crime and your lack of current employment, you need to be prepared to spend some time at the Nashua Street Jail. Jail. The word rang in his ears like a funeral bell. Richard Sterling, a man who once spent $400 on a single bottle of wine to impress a 26-year-old heiress, was going to jail. What about Alice? Richard asked, a sudden, venomous surge of hatred cutting through his panic. Can we subpoena her? She set me up. She knew about the hedge fund. She trapped me. Greg sighed heavily into the phone. Richard, stop. Just stop. Your ex-wife's legal team is a fortress. Arthur Pendleton handed the DA a perfect, legally unassailable package. She didn't forge the document. She didn't steal the money. You did. Blaming a billionaire for your own criminal greed is only going to piss the judge off at your sentencing. Be at the precinct at 8 a.m. Bring only your ID. No shoelaces, no belts. The line clicked dead. Richard dropped the phone onto the stained carpet. He walked over to the small, cracked mirror hanging above the motel sink and stared at his reflection. The man looking back at him was a stranger. The sharp jawline was covered in a scruffy, unkempt beard. The dark circles under his eyes made him look 10 years older. The confident, predatory smirk that used to define his face was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, terrified stare of a man who finally realized he was the architect of his own destruction. He had wanted to leave Alice with nothing. He had laughed at the thought of her struggling. Instead, he had handed her the hammer, the nails, and the blueprints to build his coffin, and he had even paid for the privilege. 8 months later, the oppressive, humid heat of a Boston summer baked the concrete outside the Suffolk County Superior Court. Inside, the air conditioning rattled fiercely, doing little to chill the sweat forming on the back of Richard Sterling's neck. He was no longer wearing a bespoke Italian suit. He was dressed in a faded, ill-fitting beige jumpsuit, the standard issue for inmates at the Nashua Street Jail, where he had spent the last 240 days awaiting the conclusion of his criminal case. His pristine haircut was gone, replaced by a cheap buzz cut. The arrogant, self-assured posture that had once defined him had completely collapsed. His shoulders were hunched, and his eyes darted nervously around the gallery. Richard sat at the defense table, his wrists shackled to a chain around his waist. Next to him sat Greg, the exhausted public defender who had negotiated the only lifeline left, a guilty plea. Going to trial against the forensic evidence, the digital paper trail, and the financial might of the Hayes-Bancroft Trust would have guaranteed a decade behind bars. The gallery behind them was practically empty. There were no supportive family members, no Wall Street colleagues, and certainly no Chloe Vanderwall. Richard was utterly, devastatingly alone. The Honourable Judge Eleanor Fitzgerald, a woman known for her severe, uncompromising sentences in white-collar crime cases, flipped through the final pages of the pre-sentencing report. Mr. Sterling, Judge Fitzgerald began, her voice cutting through the silent courtroom like a serrated blade. "I have read the prosecution's memorandum, and I have read your counsel's plea for leniency. Your attorney argues that you were under immense personal and professional stress, that the culture of high finance clouded your judgment, and that this was an isolated incident of desperation." She paused, taking off her reading glasses to look directly at him. Her eyes offered no sympathy. "I find that argument entirely unpersuasive. You did not steal a loaf of bread to feed a starving family. You forged your wife's signature to illegally secure $350,000, which you then immediately gambled away in a speculative hedge fund, all while continuing to lease luxury vehicles and take extravagant vacations. This was not an act of desperation. It was an act of profound, calculated greed." Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. He wanted to speak, to beg, but his voice had abandoned him months ago in a cold, concrete cell. "Furthermore," Judge Fitzgerald continued, "the victim in this case, Alice Hayes, has opted not to attend today's proceedings. However, her legal counsel has submitted a brief victim impact statement. Mr. Pendleton, you may read it into the record." From the front row of the gallery, Arthur Pendleton stood up. He looked as impeccable as ever, his silver hair perfectly combed, holding a single sheet of heavy, watermarked paper. He cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client submits the following," Arthur read, his deep voice carrying a quiet, terrifying authority. "For 7 years, Richard Sterling demanded a marriage built on a foundation of financial segregation, entirely for his own benefit. When his lifestyle outpaced his competence, he chose to violate both the law and the fundamental trust of our legal partnership. I did not engineer his downfall. I simply removed the safety net he never knew I was providing. The defendant built a cage of his own hubris. I merely allowed him to step inside and lock the door himself. I ask only that the court hold him to the same standard of accountability that he so eagerly demanded of others." Arthur folded the paper neatly, placed it in his leather briefcase, and sat down. Richard closed his eyes, a single tear cutting a track through the grime on his cheek. Alice wasn't even here to watch him burn. She had already moved on. According to a Forbes article, a guard had maliciously slipped under his cell door 2 weeks ago. Alice was currently in London, finalizing a $2.4 billion acquisition of a historic commercial district. She had reclaimed her maiden name, stepped out of the shadows, and was dominating the financial world Richard had only ever pretended to rule. He was a minor, pathetic footnote in her life. "Please stand, Mr. Sterling," Judge Fitzgerald ordered. Richard pushed himself up, the chains rattling loudly against the wooden table. His knees trembled. "Pursuant to your guilty plea for 2 counts of felony bank fraud and 1 count of aggravated identity theft, I sentence you to 48 months in the custody of the Massachusetts Department of Correction, to be served at MCI Shirley." The words hit Richard like physical blows to the chest. 4 years. Upon your release," the judge continued, her tone relentless, "you will serve 5 years of supervised probation. Additionally, you are ordered to pay full restitution of the $350,000 to the defrauded financial institution. Because your assets have been liquidated and you possess no capital, your future wages will be garnished at the maximum legal rate until the debt is satisfied." She banged her gavel, the sound echoing with dreadful finality. "Court is adjourned. Bailiffs, remand the prisoner." 2 large court officers stepped forward, grabbing Richard roughly by the arms. As they turned him towards the side door leading back to the holding cells, Richard looked over his shoulder one last time. He looked at the empty chairs where his friends should have been. He looked at Arthur Pendleton, who was quietly checking his gold pocket watch, already late for a more important meeting. And in that fleeting, devastating moment, Richard finally understood the true cost of his arrogance. He had traded a quiet, peaceful life with a billionaire for a concrete cell, a mountain of debt, and a ruined name. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind him, plunging his world into darkness. What a spectacular, utterly satisfying downfall. Richard Sterling truly thought he was the smartest person in the room, only to realize he wasn't even playing the same game as the woman he underestimated. His story is a powerful, real-life reminder that arrogance and greed are often the exact tools people use to dig their own graves. True power doesn't need to shout from a leased sports car. It speaks softly, carries a heavily audited financial portfolio, and waits for the perfect moment to strike. If you loved this story of cold, calculated karma and absolute justice, please hit that like button. It really helps out. Share this video with anyone who loves a brilliant plot twist where the underdog actually holds all the cards. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you'll never miss out on more dramatic, real-life stories of revenge, redemption, and the shocking secrets people hide behind closed doors.